Good morning, folks. Thank you all for checking in to spend a little bit of time with history this morning with our next chapter of the Confederate Relic Room's presentation of Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's book, American Hero Tales. This morning's subject is the leadership of Union General Philip Sheridan at Cedar Creek, the latest in a sequence of Union officers that Roosevelt and Lodge have been focusing on. So let's go ahead and get underway with this morning's subject. I usually make a point to the little verse that they begin each chapter with here. One thing about history, I think, because history is composed of stories, good verbal expression, even poetic verbal expression can really add to the presentation. And this time, all that's at the beginning of the chapter, instead of a few verses or an entire poem, is just a couplet. Just a couplet is there. Inspired repulsed battalions to engage and taught the doubtful battle where to rage. So short, it would almost fit on a tombstone. And in the 1890s, Sheridan at Cedar Creek, the story that's going to be told today, well, they are skipping probably because Roosevelt and Lodge think it will be too familiar to the audience, that it would be a cliche to get anywhere near what was, at one time, probably the most famous poem of the entire war. A poem titled Sheridans Ride by Thomas Buchanan Reed. And there was a time when many school children could have quoted by heart. Up from the south at break of day, bringing to Winchester fresh dismay, the affrighted air with a shudder bore like a herald in haste to the chieftain's door, the terrible grumble and rumble and roar, telling the battle was on once more, and Sheridan 20 miles away. Sheridan's Ride is almost as famous poetically in American history as Paul Revere's Ride, and I encourage you to look up perhaps and read through the entire poem, Sheridan's Ride, which was once a common reference to our heritage. And the tribute in Sheridan's Ride is not primarily to Sheridan's leadership, but rather to Sheridan's horse. So let's get underway with our protagonist for the day's events, Irish-American General Phil Sheridan. At the end of the war, General Grant would say that his cavalry commander, Sheridan, was second to none as a general, that there was no general better than him, and that there might not even be a general equal to him. Strong words indeed from President Grant, General Grant at that time. And Sheridan was very much a professional soldier. And we've seen in the book examples, the last couple examples, Lowell and Shaw, were both very much citizen soldiers, men who had not planned on a military career, but rose to the occasion to be good soldiers at necessity. Phil Sheridan is a man who is very much dedicated to being a professional soldier and military leader. Indeed, after the war, he's even going to travel to Prussia, to Europe as an observer with the Franco-Prussian War, and learn about the general staff, a new invention at that time of the Germans. He's going to learn about those professional refinements to military affairs and bring them home to be employed in the United States Army. So Sheridan spends his whole life as a professional soldier. But today we're going to look at the climactic moment of his career in many minds, and certainly in that poem, Sheridans Ride. The first the generals saw were the groups of stragglers, and then the retreating troops. What was done? What to do? A glance told him both. Then, striking his spurs with a terrible oath, he dashed down the line mid a storm of huzzas. And the wave of retreat checked its course there, because the sight of the master compelled it to pause. A moment today that's focused on by Roosevelt and Lodge in their essay. And that moment develops in the autumn of 1864. In fact, it is October of 1864, and looming is a presidential election, an election between the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, the incumbent, and the Democrat challenger, McClellan, former commander of the Union Army and considered the peace candidate. If McClellan is elected, the Union, it looks like, will stop prosecuting the war and the Confederacy win its independence. Now, if you remember earlier lessons out of this book or elsewhere, in the summer of 1863, the year before, the Union had won the great victories at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg with control of the Mississippi River. So in the fall of 1864, the Union has every military advantage. The Southern hope is that the Union will throw those advantages away by not re-electing Lincoln and instead changing course and electing McClellan. And the belief is that the best way for the South to make that happen is to have another dramatic Southern victory, a big victory like the ones in 1862. That will be discouraging to the Union public, that will tell them it seems like the war will go on forever and we're just losing more and more and more men for no purpose. That is what they want the voters to be thinking as they head off to vote in the election of 1864. So Sheridan at that time is in the Shenandoah Valley. And now let's go to the direct text that our authors give us about Phil Sheridan at that time. General Sheridan took command of the Army of the Shenandoah in August of 1864. His coming was the signal for aggressive fighting and for a series of brilliant victories over the rebel army. Sheridan's plan, skipping ahead to the autumn, was to terminate his campaign north of Staunton and returning to desolate the valley, that is the Shenandoah Valley, a rich area of farmland, sometimes called the breadbasket of the Confederacy. To desolate the valley so as to make it untenable for the Confederates as well as useless as a granary or storehouse, and then move the bulk of his army through Washington and unite them with General Grant in front of Petersburg. And Sheridan, like General Sherman, is a man who practices warfare against the enemy economy, who to desolate the valley. Sheridan's actually going to boast about the Shenandoah Valley, to say that when I get done with the Shenandoah Valley, a crow will have to carry his own rations to fly over it. In other words, that there wouldn't be enough to eat there, even for a crow. Like that other notably ruthless commander, Sherman, Sheridan, as you'll see, inspires great affection and loyalty from his soldiers. Now, there's a difference of opinion between Grant and Sheridan about what Sheridan's next move should be. And so in October, he goes to Washington, D.C. to discuss things with the higher command and come up with a plan, and then begins the ride back towards his army, gets to Winchester, Virginia, and stops there to stay overnight. And that's where the story of the Battle of Cedar Creek is going to begin for us. Because that next morning, Sheridan, as the poem says, is 20 miles away from where the action begins at Cedar Creek. He wakes up in the morning, expecting to reach his headquarters at some point that day. And then again, we'll take up the story as Roosevelt tells it. What's going on, unknown to Sheridan at that time, is that Confederate General Jubal Early, the man without a hat there on the slide, Jubal Early has launched an offensive against Sheridan's army. Now, Jubal Early has fewer men. He's got about 2/3 the size of force that Sheridan has. But like Sheridan, Early is an aggressive commander. He has seen an opportunity and he has launched an attack that morning. About 6 o'clock, Roosevelt writes, on the morning of the 19th, it was reported to him that artillery firing could be heard in the direction of Cedar Creek. But as the sound was stated to be irregular and fitful, he thought it was only a skirmish. He nevertheless arose at once and had just finished dressing when another officer came in and reported the firing was still going on in the same direction, but it did not sound like a general battle. Still, Sheridan was uneasy, and after breakfast mounted his horse between 8 and 9 o'clock and rode slowly toward Winchester. When he reached the edge of town, he halted a moment and then heard the firing of artillery in an unceasing roar. And this map from the American Battlefield Trust, use that if you're going to look for it online, American Battlefield Trust, shows what was going on. The red lines are the advancing Confederate units, which have a pretty good position there. And you see a lot of dotted blue lines, which are going backwards. In other words, as the Confederate lines hit Sheridan's army, it had begun to collapse. It was being driven. And we have that sort of L-shaped attack going on, driving in a flank, and things do not look good for the forces in blue at that point. After he'd crossed Mill Creek just outside Winchester and made the crest of the rise beyond the stream, there burst upon him in view the spectacle of a panic-stricken army. He's coming upon his own troops, completely demoralized and thrown back. Hundreds of slightly wounded men, with hundreds more unhurt but demoralized, together with the baggage wagons and trains, all were pressing to the rear in hopeless confusion. There was no doubt now that a disaster had occurred at the front. A fugitive told Sheridan that the army was broken and in full retreat. All was lost. Sheridan at once sent word to Colonel Edwards, commanding a brigade at Winchester, to stretch his troops across the valley and stop all fugitives. So he throws out a line of Union troops to stop the retreating Union troops. Nobody passed this point. His first idea was to make a stand there. But as he rode along, a different plan flashed into his mind. He believed that his troops had great confidence in him, and he determined to try to restore their broken ranks, and instead of merely holding the ground at Winchester, to rally his army and lead them forward again. And this turns into what was known as Sheridans Ride. He had hardly made up his mind to this course when news was brought to him that his headquarters at Cedar Creek was captured, and the troops dispersed. He started at once with about 20 men as an escort and rode rapidly to the front. As he passed along, the unhurt men who thickly lined the road recognized him, and as they did so, threw up their hats, shouldered their muskets, and followed him as fast as they could on foot. His officers rode out on either side to tell the stragglers the general had returned. And as the news spread, the retreating men in every direction rallied and turned their faces toward the battlefield they had left. In his memoirs, Sheridan says, speaking of his ride, "I said nothing, except to remark as I rode among them, if I had been with you this morning, this disaster would not have happened. We must face the other way. We will go back and recover our camp." Thus he galloped on over the 20 miles, with the men rallying behind him and following him in ever-increasing numbers. As he went by, the panic of retreat was replaced by the ardor of battle. Sheridan had not overestimated the power of enthusiasm or his own ability to rouse it to fighting pitch. Jumping over a rail fence, Sheridan rode to the crest of the hill, and as he took off his hat, the men rose up from behind the barricades with cheers of recognition. How near we had been to a terrible disaster can be realized by recalling what had happened before the general galloped down from Winchester. In Sheridan's absence, Early, soon after dawn, had made an unexpected attack on our army at Cedar Creek. Notice Roosevelt and Lodge refer to the Union Army here as our army. Surprised by the assault, the national troops had given way in all directions, and a panic had set in. When Sheridan rode out of Winchester, he met an already beaten army. His first thought was the natural one, to make a stand at Winchester and rally his troops about him there. His second thought was the inspiration of a great commander. He believed his men would rally as soon as they saw him. He believed that enthusiasm was one of the great weapons of war, and that this was the moment of all others when it might be used with decisive advantage. The soldiers saw him, they turned and rushed after him. He had not calculated in vain upon the power of personal enthusiasm. This is where Roosevelt and Lodge are really going with this particular story, this story of Sheridan's Ride. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll return to that poem. But there is a road from Winchester town, a good broad highway leading down, and there, through the flush of the morning light, a steed as black as the steeds of night was seen to pass. As with eagle flight, as if he knew the terrible mead, he stretched away with his utmost speed. Hills rose and fell, but his heart was gay with Sheridan 15 miles away. And each verse decreases the number of miles. Every nerve of the charger was strained to full play, and it's the next verse, with Sheridan only 10 miles away. But first the general saw were the groups of stragglers, and then the retreating troops. What was done? What to do? A glance told him both, and striking his spurs with a terrible oath, he dashed down the line with a storm of huzzas, and the wave of retreat checked its course there, because the sight of the master compelled it to pause. With foam and with dust the black charger was gray. By the flash of his eye and the red nostrils play, he seemed to the whole great army to say, I have brought you Sheridan all the way from Winchester down to save the day. The point of this story to Roosevelt in Lodge is how one man's personal leadership turned a rout into a victory. The Union had the advantage at Cedar Creek, about a 3-2 advantage of numbers against Jubal Early's already tired and poorly equipped troops. But Early's aggressive attack had thrown them into confusion. Well, Sheridan, with personal leadership, could bring those Union advantages back to bear, the advantages that have been canceled out with the morning's dismay. They could be turned around by personal leadership, personal enthusiasm, as TR uses the phrase. But then he makes a point that it wasn't simply a matter of a sort of an optimistic, positive outlook and inspiring leadership alone. He had not calculated in vain upon the power of personal enthusiasm, but at the same time, he did not rely upon any wild rush to save the day. The moment he reached the field of battle, he set to work with the coolness of a great soldier to make all the dispositions, first to repel the enemy and then to deliver an attack that could not be resisted. Once on the field of battle, the rush and hurry of the desperate ride from Winchester came to an end. Sheridan, undazzled by his brilliant success up to this point, did not mar his work by overhaste. 2 more hours passed before he was ready, and then when all was prepared, with his ranks established and his army ranged in position, he moved his whole line forward and won one of the most brilliant battles of the war, having, by his personal power over his troops and his genius in action, snatched a victory from a day which began in surprise, disaster, and retreat. So those are our points today: the importance of personal leadership and also of the good judgment of a great soldier who knows his business. And I can't help but reflect that Roosevelt's study of Sheridan at Cedar Creek perhaps helped his own leadership a few years later. Roosevelt wrote hero tales from American history before his own command of the cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders, in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And in that war, Roosevelt would prove himself to be a man who believed in and practiced the personal leadership. He didn't send the soldiers up San Juan or Kettle Hill. He led them up that hill, and would also display not just the wild personal enthusiasm, but also would display the coolness in action and the good judgment of somebody who had studied the lessons of military history and knew how to apply them tactically on the battlefield as well as in inspiring leadership. So again, if you want to dig into and enjoy that poem in full, Sheridans Ride by Thomas Buchanan Reed, is pretty easy to find out there, although it's not common culture the way it used to be. And I hope you all can join us for a naval adventure on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, a couple of days before Thanksgiving, but we are doing a session next Tuesday at 9. Our next chapter is a naval adventure, Lieutenant Cushing and the ram Albemarle. I'll learn how to pronounce it by the time we give the lesson. Thank you all. I'm going to turn off recording and give a chance for any questions if anybody's got any today. And thank you for spending your time with us.